blade hit the floor of the repair bay and split clean in two. The sound was sharp, almost musical, like a bell struck once and never again. Then, silence. Total silence. 15 crew members froze where they stood, and I froze with them, a wrench still in my hand, grease on my knuckles, my heart suddenly loud in my own ears. I am Daniel Hart. I fix things. That is the whole of what I do on this ship, and until that moment, it had never gotten me into trouble that mattered. The blade belonged to Kalis Vorn, a warrior of the Threll, tall as a doorway, with skin the color of wet slate, and eyes that never seemed to blink. He was testing the weapon's balance on a calibration rig I had built for engine components, not weapons, but he insisted, and nobody on this ship argued with Kalis Vorn. The rig applied a small, steady pressure along the blade's edge. Nothing extreme, nothing that should have mattered. And then it broke. Not bent, not chipped, broken, clean through, as if some invisible hand had taken the metal and simply decided it was finished being one piece. Kalis stared at the two halves lying on the floor. He did not move. He did not breathe, as far as I could tell. Around him, the other Threll crew backed away, slowly, the way you back away from something that might still be dangerous even after it has already happened. I did not understand yet what I was looking at. I only understood that something sacred had just died on the floor in front of me, and that everyone in that room, everyone except me, seemed to know exactly what it meant. "Someone get Commander Dane," a voice finally said. It was Ziva Kor, second in command, and even her voice, usually flat and controlled, cracked slightly on the last word. I should explain something about where I was, and how I got there. 3 years ago, humanity signed on to the Threll Fleet Compact, a mutual defense arrangement that nobody on Earth fully understood, and nobody in the Threll High Command fully trusted. We were new. We were small. We did not have their technology, their history, their ships built from alloys we could not even properly name. What we had were hands that knew how to fix things, because for most of human history, we never had enough of anything to throw away when it broke. I signed up because the pay was good and because, frankly, I was tired of fixing tractors in a town that was slowly emptying out. I did not sign up to witness what looked like a religious catastrophe unfolding in real time in front of me. Kalis knelt down. Slowly, he picked up one half of the blade, then the other, and held them together, as if trying to convince himself they would rejoin if he simply willed it hard enough. They did not. "How?" he said. Just that one word. Not to me, not to anyone. To the blade itself, maybe. I glanced at Ziva. Is someone going to tell me what's going on? She did not answer right away. Her eyes were on Kalis, and there was something in her expression I had not seen from a Threll officer before. Not anger, not disgust, something closer to grief. "That blade," she said quietly, "has been carried by every firstborn of his bloodline for 11 generations. It has never broken. Not once. Not in war, not in ceremony, not in over 300 years. I looked down at the two pieces in Kalis's hands. 300 years. I tried to imagine anything in my life that had lasted 300 years without breaking, and I could not come up with a single example. "It's just metal," I said, before I could stop myself. The room went colder than it already was. Ziva turned to look at me the way you might look at someone who has just said something deeply, dangerously stupid in a language they did not fully understand. "It is not just metal," she said. "It is memory. It is proof." Proof of what? That a bloodline is worthy to hold command. That the ancestors approve, that the line has not grown weak. I felt my stomach drop slightly. On a human ship, this would be the equivalent of some ancient family heirloom shattering, except with actual consequences attached. Consequences that apparently involved someone's right to command a warship. Kalis rose to his feet. He was still holding both halves of the blade, one in each massive hand, and when he looked at me, I understood for the first time just how large a Threll warrior truly was up close. Not just tall. Built like something meant to survive things that would kill anything else outright. "You," he said, "you built the device that tested it. I built a calibration rig, for engines. And the blade broke on it." "The blade broke because of something inside the blade," I said, and I regretted the words the instant they left my mouth, because I had no proof of that yet. I had only a feeling, a mechanic's instinct, the kind you get after years of watching things fail and starting to recognize the shape of failure before you understand its cause. Kalis took one step toward me. Just one. But it was enough to make 3 of his own crew move to put themselves slightly between us, not because they thought I was dangerous, but because they were afraid of what he might do next in a moment of grief that deep. "Careful, human," he said, And his voice had gone very quiet, which somehow felt worse than shouting would have. "You are suggesting the fault lies with the blade, and not with the one who wielded it." I understood then exactly what was happening. If the blade broke because of some flaw in the metal, that was one kind of tragedy. But if it broke because Kalis himself had somehow become unworthy, had grown weak, had failed his ancestors in some way no one could see or measure, that was an entirely different kind of tragedy, and one that would end his career, maybe his entire future, on this ship and possibly enthrall society at large. He needed it to be the metal's fault, and he needed it desperately. But needing something to be true has never once made it true. I had learned that lesson the hard way, more than once, back on Earth, back when I was young enough to think wanting something badly enough could bend reality around it. "I don't know why it broke," I said carefully. "Not yet, but I can find out, if you let me look at it properly." "You are a mechanic," Ziva said, "not a bladesmith, not a scholar of the old forging arts." "No," I agreed, "I'm not. But I've spent my whole life looking at things that failed and figuring out why. Metal doesn't lie, even if people do." That last part slipped out before I thought it through, and I saw Kalis's jaw tighten. I had, without meaning to, just implied that someone might be lying about this blade, its history, or its supposed perfection. Not the smartest thing I had ever said. Possibly not even in the top 100. But it was too late to take back. The bay doors opened, and Commander Rurik Dane walked in, and every single thrall in that room straightened immediately, the way soldiers do when someone with real authority enters a room mid-crisis. Dane was older than the others, his slate skin marked with pale scars that ran along one side of his face, and his eyes moved across the room and landed, almost instantly, on the broken pieces still held in Kalis's hands. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply looked. And then he looked at me. "Explain," he said, just the one word, aimed directly at me, as if I were somehow the most obvious source of answers in a room full of people who had known Kalis and his family blade for years, decades, in some cases their entire lives. Maybe he already suspected something the others had not yet allowed themselves to consider. "I don't have an explanation yet," I said, "just a guess." "Then guess." I looked at the broken halves. Something about the way the metal had split bothered me, had been bothering me since the moment it happened, in a way I could not fully explain, not with words, not yet. It was too clean, too even. Real metal, under real stress, does not usually break like that. It tears, it deforms, it fights back before it finally gives way. This had simply given up, all at once, like it had been waiting for permission. "Something was wrong with it," I said, "long before today, and I think whoever forged it either missed it or hid it." The words landed in that room like another blade hitting the floor. Kalis's grip on the two pieces tightened until his knuckles paled. "Careful, human," Dane said, his voice low, a warning wrapped inside two simple words. "You are accusing a forge line that predates your entire species leaving its own planet." I looked at him, and at Kalis, and at Ziva, and at all the others watching me with expressions somewhere between suspicion and dread. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said. "I just want to look at the metal. Let me look, and I'll tell you what I actually see, not what anyone wants to hear." For a long moment nobody said anything. Then Commander Dane nodded, once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has decided to gamble on something he does not fully trust, because every other option in front of him is worse. "You have until tomorrow's rotation," he said. "After that, this becomes a matter for the Thrall Council, and no amount of human guessing will help anyone." I looked down at the broken blade, at the strange, too clean fracture running through metal that was supposed to be unbreakable, and I felt something settle in my chest, something that was not quite confidence, but was close enough to it that I decided to trust it. "Understood," I said. I did not know yet what I was about to find. I only knew that whatever it was going to change more than one life on this ship, mine included, and there would be no clean way to walk it back once it came to light. I did not sleep that night. I do not think I even tried. Instead, I carried the two halves of the blade to a small workstation at the back of the repair bay, one nobody else used much, tucked behind a wall of spare hull plating where the light was dim and the air smelled faintly of coolant. I set the pieces down under a scanner I had rebuilt from salvaged parts months earlier, back when I had nothing better to do during a long patrol shift, and I began to work. Laura Bennett found me there around what passed for midnight on ship time. She was the only other human on board, a systems technician with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, and she leaned against the doorway with her arms crossed, watching me hunch over the scanner readout. You look like a man about to lose his job, she said. I might be a man about to lose more than that. She walked over and looked at the 2 pieces of blade lying side by side on the table, their fractured edges facing each other like the ends of a sentence that had been cut off mid-word. Is it really as bad as everyone's saying? Some kind of family disaster? 11 generations, I said. Never broken. Until today, on my rig. Laura winced. That's not great. No, it's not. She picked up one of the halves, careful, turning it under the light. It's beautiful, though. Look at the grain in this. Whoever made this knew what they were doing. I looked up. That's actually the problem. It's too beautiful, too perfect looking, and that's what's bothering me. How does perfect become a problem? I did not answer right away. Instead, I pulled up the scan results on the small display beside me. Images built from a dozen different passes, magnifying the fracture surface far beyond what the eye alone could ever see. What I found there confirmed the feeling I had been carrying since the moment the blade broke on the floor of the repair bay. Come look at this, I said. Laura leaned over my shoulder. On the screen, the fracture surface looked less like a clean break and more like a map, ridges and lines running in a pattern that repeated itself in a way that felt deliberate, structured, almost rhythmic. What am I looking at? Fatigue lines, I said. You see how they're arranged in these bands? That's not random damage. That's the pattern you get from repeated stress, applied the same way, over and over, for a very long time. Like bending a piece of wire back and forth until it finally snaps. But the blade was never bent, Laura said. It's a straight edge. It doesn't flex like that. Right. Which means the stress wasn't coming from how it was used. It was baked in. From the moment it was forged. Laura frowned, and I could see her mind working through the implications the same way mine had been for the last several hours. You're saying it was made wrong. I'm saying it was made with a flaw nobody was ever meant to find. A weakness sealed inside beautiful, perfect-looking metal. The kind that would hold up fine under normal handling, ceremony, careful storage. For years, decades, generations even. Right up until something finally pushed it just hard enough. Your calibration rig. My calibration rig, I agreed. Which means the blade wasn't destroyed today. It was destroyed the day it was forged. Today was just the day the truth finally came out. Laura sat down slowly on the stool beside me, letting that settle. Do you understand what you're about to tell them? Kalis needs this to be some kind of accident, some fluke. If you tell him and everyone else that the blade was flawed from the very beginning, that means the forge line responsible, the one that made every ceremonial weapon carried by his family for centuries, either made a mistake nobody caught, or hid one on purpose. I know. Do you know what that does to a culture that treats these blades as proof of worthiness, as some kind of divine approval passed down through blood? I rubbed my eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had kept me upright for hours. I don't know what it does to them, Laura. I just know what the metal is telling me, and I promised Commander Dane I'd tell him the truth, not whatever's easiest to hear. That's a very human thing to promise, she said, not unkindly. Most species out here have learned that sometimes the comfortable lie keeps the peace better than the inconvenient truth. Maybe, but I've fixed enough broken things to know that if you paper over a real problem instead of actually finding it, it doesn't go away, it just waits, and usually it comes back at the worst possible moment, with worse consequences than if you'd just dealt with it honestly the first time. Laura studied me for a long moment, then finally nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. All right, then let's actually figure out what happened. Properly, before you walk into that meeting tomorrow with nothing but a guess and a scan. We worked through the rest of that night together. Laura pulled up everything the ship's archive had on Threll forging methods, most of it heavily restricted, most of it written in a formal ceremonial dialect that took both of us far too long to translate properly. What we found painted a picture slowly, piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle from fragments scattered across centuries of records. The Threll forging tradition was built on a specific process, one passed down through master smiths in a closely guarded lineage, using a particular alloy that had never been fully explained in any record either of us could access. The alloy was folded, heated, cooled, folded again, over and over, dozens of times, in a process meant to align the metal's internal structure into something the Threll called the unbroken grain. According to their own texts, a properly forged blade using this method should be capable of enduring virtually any stress a warrior might place on it in a lifetime of service. But nowhere, in any record, did the process actually explain how the smiths verified that the unbroken grain had truly been achieved. It seemed to rely entirely on the master smith's own judgment, developed over years of apprenticeship, an art passed from teacher to student with no independent way to check the final result. No scanning, no testing, just faith in the hands and eyes of a single craftsman, repeated across 11 generations of the same forge line. That's the gap, I said, staring at the translated text as the ship's lights dimmed slightly to mark the artificial night cycle. They never had a way to actually verify the work. They just trusted it. And if one smith at some point over 300 years got it slightly wrong, Laura said slowly, or maybe rushed a batch, or used a slightly different technique without realizing the difference mattered, nobody would ever know, not until the blade finally failed. Not until something applied exactly the right kind of stress, in exactly the right way, to finally expose it. Your rig. My rig, I said again, and felt the weight of that settle differently this time, less like blame and more like simple, unavoidable fact. I had not broken the blade. I had simply been the first tool precise enough to reveal what had already been broken, quietly, invisibly, for who knew how long. By the time the ship's lights brightened again to mark the start of the new cycle, Laura and I had put together something close to a full picture. Not a complete one. We were not metallurgists, not by trade, and there were gaps in our understanding that no amount of overnight research could fully close. But we had enough to walk into that meeting with something better than a guess. I gathered the scan images, the translated records, and a small sample I had carefully cut from one of the broken edges for closer analysis, and I made my way toward the command deck where Commander Dane had said the council would gather. Ziva Kaur met me at the entrance, her expression unreadable, though there were faint shadows beneath her eyes that suggested she too had not slept much. "You look like you've been awake all night," she said. "I have." "Did you find something?" I held up the small case containing the sample and the data drive, with everything Laura and I had assembled. "I found something. Whether anyone in there wants to hear it is a different question." Ziva studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, just slightly, from wariness toward something closer to curiosity, maybe even the beginning of respect. "Kalis has not slept either," she said quietly. "He has been in the observation deck since the incident, staring at nothing. This matters to him more than you understand, human, more than his career, more than his rank. This is about whether he is still worthy to carry his family's name." "I understand that it matters," I said. "I'm not trying to take that away from him. Then what are you trying to do?" I thought about it for a moment before answering, choosing my words as carefully as I could manage on almost no sleep. "I'm trying to find out what actually happened, because I think the truth, whatever it turns out to be, is going to matter a lot more to him in the long run than a comfortable lie would." Ziva was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly, and stepped aside to let me pass through the doors and into the room where Commander Dane, Kalis Vorn, and several other senior Threll officers were already waiting, their expressions ranging from cautious to openly hostile. I walked in, set the case down on the table in front of them, and took a breath. Whatever happened next, there was no going back from it. The room was silent when I walked in, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your chest before a single word gets spoken. Commander Dane sat at the head of a long table built from some dark, polished material I did not recognize. Kalis stood near the window, his back mostly to the room, staring out at the slow drift of stars beyond the glass. He had not slept. I could tell by the way he held himself, tense and hollow at the same time, like something wound too tight and left that way for hours. 4 other officers sat along the table, each one wearing an expression I can only describe as carefully controlled disapproval. They did not want me here. They did not want a human standing in a room where the fate of a bloodline was about to be decided. I set the case down on the table anyway. "Report," Commander Dane said. I opened the case, pulled out the data drive and connected it to the small display built into the center of the table. The scan images appeared, magnified fracture patterns glowing faintly against the dark surface. "The blade did not fail because of anything Kalis did," I said. "It failed because of a flaw that existed inside the metal from the moment it was forged." The silence in the room changed texture, becoming sharper, more dangerous. One of the officers, older, with deep lines etched into his slate-colored face, leaned forward. "You are claiming the forge line is at fault." "I'm not claiming anything about blame," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "I'm telling you what the metal shows. Look here." I pointed to the repeating pattern in the fracture surface, the same bands Laura and I had studied through the night. "These lines are fatigue patterns. They form when internal stress builds up slowly over time, hidden inside material that looks perfectly fine from the outside. The blade wasn't weakened by use. It was weakened before it was ever used at all. Kalis finally turned from the window. His eyes fixed on the image on the display, and something in his expression cracked slightly, the careful stillness he had been holding all night beginning to fracture along its own hidden lines. "That is not possible," he said quietly. "The forging process has been refined across generations. Every smith trained in the old ways, every blade tested by hand, by eye, by the judgment of masters." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "Your forging process has no way to verify the internal structure of the finished blade. It relies entirely on the smith's experience and judgment. No scanning, no testing beyond what a trained eye can see on the surface. If even one smith, at any point across 300 years, made a small mistake in the folding process, or worked with metal that had a tiny impurity, there would be no way to catch it. The flaw would hide inside the blade indefinitely, invisible, until something finally applied exactly the right kind of stress to expose it." "You are saying our ancestors were careless," the older officer said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm saying they were human," I said, then immediately corrected myself. "I mean they were people, skilled, careful people, doing incredibly precise work using only their hands and their eyes, without the kind of tools that could verify their results independently. That's not carelessness, that's just the limit of what any craftsman can achieve without a way to check their own work." Commander Dane studied the image on the display for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And you believe this flaw existed since the blade's original forging? Not something that developed recently, through wear or damage?" "Yes," I said. "The fatigue pattern is too deep, too consistent, too evenly distributed through the core of the metal. This isn't something that happened from ordinary use over the years. This is something that was there from the very beginning, growing slowly worse every time the blade was stressed even slightly, until today, when my calibration rig finally applied enough precise, sustained pressure to push it past its limit." Kalis crossed the room slowly and stood over the display, staring down at the magnified image of the fracture that had ended, or at least, deeply damaged, everything he had built his identity around. "If what you say is true," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "then every blade forged by my family's line carries the same risk. Every weapon in every household descended from our forge could fail the same way, at any moment, without warning." The room went very still. I had not fully considered that implication until he said it out loud, but the moment he did, I understood immediately that he was right. If the flaw existed in the process itself, not in some isolated batch of metal, it could be present in dozens, maybe hundreds of blades scattered across Threll society. Weapons carried by warriors who trusted them completely, weapons that could fail at the worst possible moment. "That's possible," I admitted. "I can't say for certain without examining other examples, but if the same forging method was used consistently, without any way to verify the internal structure, then yes, the same risk could exist in other blades as well." One of the younger officers who had been silent until now finally spoke. "Then this is no longer a matter of one broken blade or one warrior's honor. This is a matter that could affect the safety of everyone who carries a weapon from that lineage." Commander Dane nodded slowly. "Agreed. Which raises a difficult question. Do we bring this before the wider council, and risk exposing a flaw that could shake confidence in the forge lines across the entire fleet? Or do we handle this quietly, and risk leaving warriors carrying weapons that could fail them when they need them most?" Nobody answered right away. I could see the weight of the decision settling over the room, the kind of choice that had consequences reaching far beyond this one repair bay, this one broken blade, this one warrior standing frozen by the display. Kalis finally spoke, his voice steadier now, though still carrying the rawness of the last several hours. "There is a third option." Everyone turned to look at him. "Fix it," he said, "not hide the truth. Not simply replace it with a new blade forged the same flawed way, carrying the same hidden risk. Fix the one that broke, and prove that it can be trusted again, and use what we learned to examine the others." Commander Dane raised an eyebrow. "You wish to repair a blade that is already broken, using methods outside our own tradition." "I wish to survive my next patrol with a weapon I can trust," Kalis said. "And right now, the only person on this ship who has actually looked closely enough to understand why my blade failed is standing in this room, and he is not Threll." Every eye in the room turned toward me. I had not expected this. I had come here to report what I found, not to volunteer myself for a repair job that, as far as I knew, had never been attempted by anyone, human or Threll, in the entire history of either species dealing with each other. "I'm not a bladesmith," I said carefully. "I fix engines. Hull plating, life support systems. I've never repaired a ceremonial weapon in my life. But you understand metal, Kalis said. You understood what my own people's masters, trained for generations, failed to see. Understanding a problem and being able to fix it are two very different things. Can you fix it? Commander Dane asked directly, cutting through the back and forth. Not whether you have done it before, whether you believe it is possible. I hesitated. I thought about the two broken halves sitting in the case beside me, about the strange, clean fracture line, about the fatigue pattern buried deep inside metal that had looked, on the surface, absolutely perfect. I thought about every engine I had ever rebuilt from parts other people had given up on, every system I had patched together on a supply budget too thin to afford proper replacement parts. Every time someone more experienced than me had said something could not be done, and I had done it anyway, not because I was more skilled, but because I had learned, out of necessity, how to look at broken things differently than people who had never had to make do with less. I think it's possible, I said finally. I can't promise it will be perfect. I can't promise it will look the way it did before, or that it will meet whatever standards your forging tradition expects. But I think I can make it strong again. Maybe stronger than it was. The older officer scoffed audibly. Stronger. Using techniques that have no history, no tradition behind them, applied by a species that has been part of this fleet for less than 3 years. With respect, I said, meeting his gaze directly, my species didn't have the luxury of relying on perfect materials handed down by ancient forge lines. For most of our history, we've had to fix things with whatever we had, because we couldn't afford to simply replace what broke. That taught us a few tricks your tradition never needed to develop, because you never had to. Commander Dane studied me for a long moment, then looked at Kalis, who nodded once, firmly, his decision clearly made. Very well, Dane said. You have 3 rotations to repair the blade, human. If you succeed, we will examine what you have done and decide how to proceed with the other weapons from that forge line. If you fail, the blade remains broken, and this matter goes before the full council, with all the consequences that follows for Kalis and his family name. Understood, I said, though privately, my stomach had tightened into something close to genuine fear. 3 rotations was not much time to attempt something I had never done before, on a piece of metal I did not fully understand, using an alloy whose exact composition remained, even after a full night of research, only partially clear to me. One more thing, Kalis said, before the meeting fully dissolved. He walked over to me, standing close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet his eyes. If you do this, you do it honestly, not hiding flaws behind decoration. Not pretending the blade was never broken. I would rather carry a weapon that shows its scars than one that lies about its own history. I looked at him for a long moment, surprised by the request, though perhaps I should not have been. That's exactly how I was planning to do it. He nodded once, and for the first time since the blade had shattered on the floor of the repair bay, something in his expression eased, just slightly, like a held breath finally beginning to release. I gathered the case, the data drive, the 2 broken halves of a blade that had carried 11 generations of history, and walked back toward the repair bay, already turning over in my mind everything I would need to do in the next 3 rotations, and trying very hard not to think too much about what would happen to Kalis, and to me, if I failed. 3 rotations, that was all I had. I stood in the repair bay staring at the 2 broken halves laid out on the workbench, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I let myself feel the full size of what I had agreed to do. Laura found me there within the hour, arms crossed, watching me pace back and forth in front of the bench like a man trying to talk himself out of a decision already made. You told them you could fix it, she said. I told them I thought it was possible. Same thing, as far as they're concerned. Thanks, very helpful. She smiled slightly, then walked over and picked up one of the broken halves, turning it carefully under the light. All right, talk me through it. What are you actually planning to do? I pulled up the scan data again, spreading the images across the display beside the bench. The core problem is the internal structure. Whatever flaw exists inside this metal, it's been there since the original forging, hidden beneath a surface that looks perfect. If I just try to weld the 2 pieces back together the way a Threll smith would, using their traditional method, I'll be reproducing the exact same blind process that caused the failure in the first place. No way to verify the internal grain. No way to know if I've actually fixed anything or just hidden the problem again under a fresh surface. So what's the alternative? Diffusion bonding, I said. It's a technique we developed on Earth, mostly out of necessity, back when we didn't have access to enough raw material to simply melt down and reforge everything that broke. Instead of melting the metal completely, You bring the two surfaces together under precise heat and pressure, low enough to avoid destroying the existing grain structure, but high enough to let the atoms across the boundary actually merge together properly. Done right, the bonded seam can end up stronger than the surrounding material, because you're not disturbing the parts of the blade that were already sound. Laura frowned, considering this. And the parts that weren't sound? The actual flaw? That's the part I still need to figure out, I admitted. I can bond the two halves back together, but if the same weakness that caused this fracture still exists somewhere else in the blade, we're just delaying the next failure, not preventing it. So you need to find every weak point, not just fix the one that already broke. Exactly. We spent the rest of that first rotation running the blade through every scan I could manage with the equipment on board, mapping the entire structure piece by piece, searching for any other hint of the same fatigue pattern that had caused the original fracture. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required total focus, and more than once I caught myself holding my breath without realizing it, terrified of missing something that might matter. Around the middle of that first rotation, Kalis appeared at the entrance to the bay. He did not say anything at first, simply stood watching from a distance, his presence unmistakable even in silence. "You don't have to babysit me," I said, without looking up from the scanner. "I am not babysitting," he said. "I am observing." "Same thing, from where I'm standing." He walked closer, studying the scan images displayed above the workbench. "What have you found?" "Two more small areas showing early signs of the same fatigue pattern," I said, pointing to faint markings near the hilt and roughly a third of the way down the blade's original length. Nowhere near as severe as the fracture point, but if left alone, they would likely have failed eventually too, given enough time and stress. Kalis was quiet for a long moment, studying the images. So the flaw was not isolated to a single point. It was distributed through the entire blade. "It looks that way, yes." "Then repairing only the fracture would not have been enough." "No," I agreed. "It wouldn't." He looked at me then, something unreadable in his expression. "You could have simply bonded the two halves back together, declared it fixed, and let the remaining weaknesses go unmentioned. I would likely never have known, not until they failed on their own, perhaps at a far worse moment than this one." "I could have," I admitted. "But you specifically asked me not to hide anything, and even if you hadn't, I wouldn't have done it that way regardless. A repair that only looks fixed on the surface isn't a repair. It's just a longer, more dangerous kind of failure waiting to happen." Something in Kalis's posture shifted slightly, and though his expression remained largely unreadable to me, I thought I saw the faintest trace of something like respect settle into it. "My people believe a blade forged properly should never require repair," he said quietly. "That belief has shaped how we build, how we test, how we pass judgment on a smith's skill. A blade that breaks is considered a failure of the bloodline, not the metal. What you are describing, this idea of building something, finding its weaknesses honestly, and strengthening it through those very weaknesses, is foreign to everything I was raised to believe about what makes a weapon worthy. Where I come from," I said, "nothing gets treated as perfect. Everything wears down eventually. The measure of good work isn't whether something can survive forever without ever needing attention. It's whether the person who built it, or the person maintaining it, is honest enough to catch problems before they become disasters, and skilled enough to actually fix them when they do." Kalis considered this in silence for a long while before finally speaking again. "That is a very different philosophy than my own." "Maybe," I said, "but it's also the only reason I might actually be able to save this blade instead of just hiding what's wrong with it until it fails again at the worst possible time." He nodded slowly, and for the rest of that first rotation he stayed, watching, occasionally asking careful, precise questions about what I was doing and why, questions that suggested a mind far more curious and far more open than the tense, grief-stricken warrior I had first encountered standing over two broken pieces of metal on the floor of the repair bay. By the start of the second rotation, Laura and I had mapped every weak point in the blade structure and had begun the actual repair work, using a small diffusion bonding rig I had adapted from equipment originally meant for hull plating repairs. The process was slow, methodical, requiring constant attention to temperature and pressure, the kind of work that left no room for distraction or shortcuts. Ziva Kor visited partway through the second rotation, standing at the edge of the bay with an expression that suggested skepticism mixed with something close to fascination. "The others are talking," she said. "Some believe you will fail, and that this entire attempt only delays the inevitable dishonor. Others believe you might actually succeed, and are unsure whether that would be a good thing or something far more troubling." "Troubling how?" "If a human can repair a flaw that generations of Threll smiths never caught, using methods our own tradition has never considered, It raises uncomfortable questions about how much we truly understand our own craft. I'm not trying to prove anyone wrong, I said, carefully adjusting the pressure settings on the bonding rig. I'm just trying to fix a piece of metal, and hopefully save someone from carrying a weapon that could fail him at the worst possible moment. Perhaps, Ziva said, but intentions rarely change how outcomes are received. I did not have a good answer for that, so I said nothing, and continued the slow, careful work of aligning the fractured edges precisely enough for the bonding process to succeed. The work continued through the rest of the second rotation and well into the third, with Kalis present for most of it, watching in near silence, occasionally helping steady a component when an extra set of hands was needed. Laura managed the scans and calculations, double-checking every measurement before I applied heat or pressure, and slowly, painstakingly, the fractured pieces began to draw back together, not as they once were, but as something new, something built with full awareness of every weakness the original had carried, and reinforced precisely at every point where that weakness had been found. By the final hours of the third rotation, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones, the kind that makes your hands shake slightly, even when you desperately need them steady. Laura had gone quiet beside me, her focus narrowed entirely on the readings scrolling across the display, and Kalis stood close, his presence somehow both a comfort and an added weight of pressure I could not fully shake. "How much longer?" he asked quietly, as I made the final adjustments to the bonding rig. "Almost done," I said, my voice rougher than I intended, worn down by 3 rotations with barely any real rest. "This is the last section. If this bond holds properly, we're finished." He said nothing, simply watched, and I could feel the weight of everything riding on the next several minutes, not just for him, not just for me, but for whatever fragile, uncertain trust had begun quietly building between 2 very different peoples who had, until 3 days ago, barely understood each other at all. I made the final adjustment, watched the readings settle into the range I needed, and held my breath as the last bond slowly formed, sealing the final seam of a blade that had shattered on the floor of this very room only 3 days before, and now, if everything had gone right, stood ready to be tested once again. The bonding rig powered down with a quiet hum, and for a long moment none of us moved. I stared at the blade lying on the workbench, whole again, a single piece where 3 days ago there had been 2 broken halves, and a room full of people convinced that something ancient and irreplaceable had just been lost forever. A thin line ran along its length, visible if you knew exactly where to look, a pale seam marking every point where the metal had been carefully rejoined and reinforced. Kalis stepped forward slowly, and I stepped back to let him approach the bench without anyone crowding him. This moment belonged to him, not to me, no matter how many hours I had spent getting the blade to this point. He reached out and picked it up, testing its weight in his hand the way I imagined he had done 1,000 times before with the original, whole weapon. His expression was difficult to read, a mixture of caution and something rawer underneath, something that looked almost like fear, that this fragile hope might still be taken from him. "It feels different," he said quietly. My stomach dropped slightly. Different how? Heavier perhaps, or perhaps that is only my own mind, unable to forget what I watched happen to it 3 days ago. He turned the blade slowly, catching the light along its edge, following the faint pale line running through the metal. "This mark, it will always be visible." "Yes," I said. I could have tried to polish it out, hide the seam completely, make it look untouched. But you told me not to hide anything, and even setting that aside, disguising the repair would have meant guessing at the surface finish, instead of focusing entirely on making the bond itself as strong as possible. I chose strength over appearance. Kalis studied the seam for a long moment in silence. Around us, several other Threll crew members had gathered, drawn by word that the repair attempt was finally finished, and I could feel the weight of their collective attention pressing down on the room, waiting, judging, uncertain what to expect. "In my tradition," Kalis said slowly, "a mark like this would normally be considered shameful, a visible flaw, proof that the weapon, and by extension the warrior who carries it, has been broken and mended, rather than remaining pure and untouched." I felt my chest tighten slightly, waiting for whatever came next, uncertain whether 3 days of work was about to be rejected outright because of a philosophy I had known about but had chosen to set aside anyway. "But," he continued, and something in his voice shifted, "where I come from, we have never had to consider what a mended thing actually looks like, because nothing has ever survived being broken before. We have no tradition for this, because we have never needed one." He turned the blade slowly in the light again, studying the seam from a different angle. "Where you come from, Daniel. How do your people regard something that has been broken and repaired? I thought about it for a moment, choosing my words carefully. Where I come from, a repaired tool that keeps working, sometimes even better than before, is worth more than a fragile one that's never been tested. We don't hide scars, mostly. We tell stories about them. A machine that's been rebuilt after failing usually gets trusted more, not less, because someone has already proven it can survive the worst and keep going. Kalis was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, some old certainty slowly giving way to a new possibility he had clearly never considered before this entire ordeal began. Then perhaps, he said slowly, this mark should not be hidden. Perhaps it should be seen, not as proof of weakness, but as proof that when tested, truly tested, this blade did not fail beyond recovery. It broke, and it was made whole again, stronger at every point where the weakness once lived. He held the blade up, turning it so that the seam caught the light clearly, visible to everyone gathered in the bay. I will not hide this, he said, his voice steadier now, carrying to every corner of the room. Let it be known. My family's blade broke, because a flaw hidden inside it for 3 centuries finally surfaced, and it was repaired, not by a Threll Smith following the old ways, but by a human engineer who looked at the failure honestly, found every hidden weakness, and rebuilt what was broken into something stronger than what came before. A murmur ran through the gathered crew, a mixture of surprise and, in some cases, obvious discomfort. The older officer who had scoffed at me during the council meeting stood near the back, his expression carefully neutral, though I could see the tension in his jaw. You intend to carry a marked blade, he said, his voice edged with disbelief, openly, before the council, before your own bloodline's legacy. I intend to carry a blade I actually trust, Kalis said, turning to face him directly. One that has been examined honestly, repaired honestly, and tested beyond what any ceremonial blade in our history has ever been tested before. If that requires carrying a visible mark, then I will carry it, and I will explain exactly what it means to anyone who asks. The older officer said nothing further, though his expression suggested he was far from convinced. Commander Dane arrived partway through this exchange, drawn, like the others, by word spreading quickly through the ship that the repair had been completed. He studied the blade in Kalis's hands for a long moment, then looked at me, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile, a welcome change from the wariness I had grown used to over the past 3 days. You finished within the time given, he said. Just barely, I admitted. There were 3 separate weak points, not just the original fracture. It took the full 3 rotations to find and repair all of them properly. Show me, Dane said. I pulled up the scan data on a portable display and walked him through everything. The original fracture, the 2 additional weak points near the hilt and along the blade's length, the diffusion bonding process used to repair each one, and the follow-up scans confirming that the internal structure at each repaired point now showed no trace of the fatigue pattern that had originally caused the failure. Dane studied the data in silence for a long while, his expression giving nothing away. Finally he looked up, first at me, then at Kalis, then at the blade itself. This changes things considerably, he said. If the flaw exists in the forging process itself, and not merely in this single blade, then other weapons from the same lineage may carry the same hidden risk. This cannot remain a private matter between Kalis and his own family. I understand, Kalis said. I am prepared to bring this before the council myself, and to explain everything, including how the repair was made, and by whom. Dane nodded slowly. It will not be an easy conversation. Some among the council will not welcome the idea that human methods succeeded where generations of Threll tradition could not. Then let them be uncomfortable, Kalis said, and there was a new firmness in his voice that had not been there 3 days ago, when he had knelt on the floor of this same repair bay, staring at 2 broken halves of everything he believed defined him. The truth matters more than comfort. I would rather face difficult questions honestly than carry a weapon I cannot fully trust, or allow others to carry the same risk unknowingly, simply because acknowledging it feels shameful. Dane studied him for a long moment, then allowed something close to a small, approving nod. Your ancestors would likely have very complicated feelings about this outcome. Perhaps, Kalis said, but I believe they would prefer a descendant who survives to carry their name honestly, over one who dies carrying a flawed weapon simply because admitting its flaws felt too difficult. The room was quiet for a moment after that, the weight of his words settling over everyone gathered there. Laura, standing beside me throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up, breaking the tension slightly. For what it's worth, the repair should hold well beyond normal use. We tested the bonded sections extensively before finishing. If anything, those specific points are now among the strongest sections of the entire blade. Stronger than the original forging, Kalis said, testing the words slowly, as though trying them on for the first time. At those specific points, yes, I said. The rest of the blade is exactly as it was before, minus the flaws we identified and corrected. We didn't rebuild the whole thing. We just fixed what was actually broken, and reinforced what was almost broken, without touching what didn't need fixing in the first place. Kalis looked down at the blade one final time, running his thumb gently along the pale seam marking its length, and something in his posture finally, fully relaxed, the tension of the last 3 days visibly draining out of him for the first time since I had first seen him kneeling on this floor, holding 2 broken pieces of everything he thought defined his worth. "Thank you," he said quietly, looking directly at me. "I do not know if my own people will fully understand what you have done here, but I understand it, and I will not forget it." I did not have a particularly eloquent response ready for that. I simply nodded, exhausted, relieved beyond words that 3 days of careful, desperate work had actually paid off. But even as the tension in the room eased, and the gathered crew slowly began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed, I could not shake a small, persistent worry settling in the back of my mind. The council still had to be told. The other blades from Kalis's forge line still had to be examined. And somewhere out there, across the wider Threll fleet, an unknown number of warriors were still carrying weapons that might share the exact same hidden flaw, weapons that had never been tested the way this one just had, weapons that could fail at any moment, without warning, exactly when their carriers needed them most. This was not over, not by a long distance. It was, I realized slowly, only just beginning. The council chamber was larger than anything I had seen on this ship, a wide circular room with tiered seating rising along the walls, filled with senior Threll officers from across the fleet, most of whom I had never met, and who were now staring at me with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open suspicion. I stood beside Kalis near the center of the room, the repaired blade resting on a display stand in front of us, its pale seam clearly visible under the bright overhead lighting. Commander Dane stood nearby, along with Ziva, and Laura had insisted on coming as well, standing just behind me, arms crossed, ready to back up every technical detail if anyone tried to challenge it. An older Threll woman with silver markings along her temples rose from the highest tier of seating. Her presence alone seemed to quiet the room instantly. "Counselor Isla Rask," Ziva murmured beside me, "senior advisor on matters of forged tradition. If anyone here is going to challenge this, it will be her." Counselor Rask descended slowly toward the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the blade resting on its stand. She circled it once, studying the scene from every angle, before finally speaking. "You claim this blade failed due to a flaw present since its original forging," she said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber without needing to be raised. "Yes," Kalis said. "The flaw was confirmed through detailed scanning, conducted after the failure occurred. Fatigue patterns consistent with hidden internal stress present not only at the point of fracture, but at 2 additional locations along the blade's length. And you allowed a human to repair it," Rask said, turning her gaze toward me for the first time, rather than seeking a master smith trained in the proper forging traditions. "I allowed a human to repair it," Kalis said, "because no master smith trained in our traditions possessed the tools or the methods necessary to identify the flaw in the first place, let alone correct it without risking further hidden damage." A ripple of murmurs ran through the assembled council. Rask held up a hand, and the room fell silent again almost instantly. "Explain," she said, looking directly at me now. "In simple terms, I have no patience for engineering jargon dressed up to sound more impressive than it is." I took a breath, steadying myself. "Your forging tradition relies entirely on a smith's skill and judgment to achieve what your records call the unbroken grain, but there's no independent way to verify that the internal structure actually meets that standard once the blade is finished. It relies completely on trust in the smith's experience. If even one small mistake occurs during that process, and there's no way to check for it afterward, that mistake stays hidden inside the metal indefinitely, sometimes for centuries, until something finally applies enough of the right kind of stress to expose it. And you believe this happened with Kalis Vorn's blade specifically?" "I know it happened," I said. "The scan data is clear. The fatigue pattern is consistent with a flaw introduced during the original forging process, not something caused by ordinary wear or misuse over the years." Rask studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And your repair?" Explain how it differs from a flaw simply hidden beneath a new surface. I gestured to Laura, who stepped forward and pulled up the scan comparisons on the chamber's central display, showing the original fracture data alongside the post-repair scans. We used a technique called diffusion bonding, I said. Instead of melting the metal and reforging it, which would risk introducing new flaws the same way the original process apparently did, we brought the fractured surfaces together under carefully controlled heat and pressure, low enough to preserve the sound structure already present, but precise enough to let the metal properly fuse at the atomic level. We then scanned every section of the blade, found 2 additional weak points beyond the original fracture, and repaired those as well, using the same method. The seam remains visible, Rask observed. Intentionally, Kalis said, before I could answer. I asked that nothing be hidden. This blade broke because of a flaw my people's tradition had no way to detect. I will not compound that failure by pretending it never happened. Rask circled the blade once more, studying the seam closely, her expression still difficult to read. Finally, she looked up, addressing the wider council rather than just Kalis or myself. If what has been presented here is accurate, she said, then this flaw may not be limited to a single blade, or even a single family line. It may exist within the broader forging tradition itself, hidden across generations, undetected simply because we have never possessed the means to detect it. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, some sharp with alarm, others openly dismissive, a wave of noise that took several moments to settle even after Rask raised her hand again. This requires immediate investigation, she said, once the room had quieted. Every ceremonial blade currently in active service must be scanned using the methods demonstrated here today. If the same flaw exists elsewhere, we cannot afford to discover it the way Kalis Vorn discovered his, in the middle of a duel or a battle, when failure could cost a life rather than simply an afternoon's shock. An officer near the back, the same older man who had scoffed at me during the earlier council meeting, rose to his feet. You propose we allow a human, using human methods barely 3 years old to us, to inspect and potentially correct weapons carried by our own warriors for generations. This is deeply inappropriate. Do you have an alternative method for detecting internal flaws that our own forging tradition has never developed? Rask asked pointedly. The officer hesitated, clearly caught without a ready answer. Then perhaps, Rask continued, inappropriate is a smaller concern than allowing our warriors to continue carrying weapons that might fail them without warning, simply because acknowledging an uncomfortable truth feels difficult. The officer sat back down without further argument, though his expression remained sour. Rask turned back toward me and Kalis. This engineer's methods will be reviewed and, assuming they hold up under further scrutiny, adopted as a standard inspection process across the fleet. Every forge line will be examined. Every blade currently in service will be scanned. This will take time, and it will not be a comfortable process for many who have long believed our traditions incapable of hidden failure. Understood, Kalis said. Rask's gaze shifted back to me one final time. You have done our people an uncomfortable service, human. I suspect many will resent you for it before they come to appreciate it. That is often the way with uncomfortable truths. I didn't do it to earn appreciation, I said. I did it because a piece of metal was telling me something important, and ignoring it felt like a worse choice than dealing with whatever came next. Something in Rask's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest genuine respect, a sound philosophy. Perhaps more of my own people should adopt it. The council session continued for a while longer, working through logistics, timelines, and the difficult political questions surrounding how to inform families across the fleet that weapons they had trusted for generations might carry hidden risks. I mostly stood quietly through the rest of it, exhausted, relieved, and increasingly aware that whatever had started with a single broken blade on the floor of a repair bay was now reshaping something far larger than I had ever anticipated when this entire ordeal began. Afterward, as the chamber slowly emptied, Kalis found me near the entrance, the repaired blade now secured properly at his side, rather than resting on a display stand. You did not have to defend your methods so directly in there, he said. Rask can be formidable when challenged. She asked good questions, I said. I just answered them honestly. He studied me for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. That seems to be a consistent pattern with you. Fixing things honestly tends to work better than fixing them quietly and hoping nobody looks too closely, I said. I learned that lesson a long time ago, usually the hard way. Kalis nodded slowly, then extended a hand toward me, an unfamiliar gesture I recognized as a distinctly human custom he had clearly picked up somewhere during his time serving alongside us. I shook it, and something about the simple, deliberate act felt like it carried far more weight than words alone could have managed. "Whatever comes of this," he said, "whatever the council ultimately decides, whatever my own people come to believe about what happened here, I will not forget standing in that repair bay, watching my family's blade break apart on the floor, and believing everything I valued had ended with it." "And now?" "Now," he said, glancing down at the pale seam still visible along the blade's length, "I understand that some things, broken honestly and repaired honestly, can become more trustworthy than they ever were before, simply because their weaknesses are no longer hidden." I thought about that for a long moment, about 3 days of exhausting, uncertain work, about a night spent poring over unfamiliar records with Laura, about a room full of skeptical officers slowly, grudgingly coming to accept an uncomfortable truth, because the alternative was worse. "That's not a bad way to think about it," I said. Kalis allowed something close to a genuine smile, rare and brief, but unmistakably real. "Perhaps your species has more to teach mine than either of us realized, 3 years ago, when this alliance first began." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe we just got lucky that a blade decided to break in front of the one person on this ship stubborn enough to actually look closely at why." He laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, and for the first time since I had watched 2 broken halves hit the floor of the repair bay, I let myself believe that everything that followed, all the difficult conversations still ahead, all the uncomfortable truths still waiting to be uncovered across the wider fleet, might actually lead somewhere worth reaching. Word of what happened in that council chamber spread quickly across the ship, and eventually, across the wider fleet, though not without resistance, not without difficult conversations, and not without more than a few warriors initially insulted by the suggestion that human methods had succeeded where generations of their own tradition had failed. But slowly, blade by blade, ship by ship, the inspections began, and slowly, the fleet started to trust something new, something built, not on ancient assumption, but on honest examination, and careful, deliberate repair. And somewhere in the middle of all that change, quietly, without much fanfare, humanity earned something it had not fully possessed before that single blade shattered on the floor of a repair bay. Respect, not because we were stronger, or faster, or more advanced, but because when something broke, we knew how to look closely enough to understand why, and cared enough to fix it honestly, scars and all. 6 weeks after the council chamber accepted my methods, a distress signal reached our ship from a Threll outpost 3 systems away, and everything I thought I understood about how far this whole situation might reach was about to change again. The message came through, garbled, half-corrupted, but the core of it was clear enough. A training exercise had gone wrong. A ceremonial blade, carried by a young officer named Corin Vess during a routine sparring match, had shattered mid-strike, and the resulting injury had left him in critical condition in the outpost's medical bay. Commander Dane called me to the bridge within minutes of the signal arriving. "This is exactly what Rask warned the council about," he said, pacing in a way I had not seen from him before, controlled but clearly rattled. "A blade failing in the middle of active use, rather than during a calm inspection in a repair bay. Do we know if it's the same forge line?" I asked. "Preliminary reports suggest yes, a distant branch of the same lineage as Kalis, though the connection is several generations removed." Laura was already pulling up navigation data on a nearby console. "We're close enough to reach that outpost within half a day if we adjust course now." Dane looked at me. "You are the only person in this fleet who has successfully diagnosed and repaired this particular flaw. I need you on that outpost." I did not hesitate, though a part of me, quietly, was terrified of what I might find when we arrived. Kalis's blade had broken in a controlled setting, under careful testing, with time to think, to plan, to research before attempting anything. This was different. This was already an injury, already a crisis, and whatever I found when I got there would need answers far faster than 3 rotations could provide. Kalis insisted on coming with me, along with Laura and a small support team Dane assembled from the ship's medical staff. The journey passed in tense, mostly silent preparation, running through every scenario I could think of, trying to anticipate what condition the broken blade might be in, what additional flaws might exist, what I would need on hand to address them quickly. The outpost itself was smaller than our ship, a compact research and training facility orbiting a quiet, unremarkable moon. We were met at the docking bay by an anxious officer who led us directly to the medical wing, where Corin Vess lay recovering from what the medical staff described as a deep laceration, serious but, thankfully, not life-threatening. He had been lucky. The blade had failed at an angle that caused injury rather than something far worse. His father, a senior officer named Talus Vess, met us outside the medical bay, his expression a complicated mixture of relief that his son had survived and barely restrained anger at the situation as a whole. "I was told a human might be able to explain why this happened," he said, his tone clipped, controlled, but clearly strained. "I can look at the blade and try to find out," I said. "I can't promise answers immediately, but I have experience with exactly this kind of failure." Talus led us to a secure storage room where the broken weapon had been kept since the incident, still in two pieces, much like the blade that had started this entire journey weeks earlier. But the moment I examined it closely, running an initial scan, I realized this situation was different, more complicated than the case with Kalus's blade had been. "This isn't the same flaw," I said slowly, studying the readings. Laura leaned over my shoulder, frowning at the data. "Are you sure? The fracture pattern looks similar." "Similar, but not identical." I pointed to a section of the readout. Kalus's blade failed due to fatigue lines from a flawed folding process during forging. This one has something else going on. "Look at this discoloration along the grain, here and here. That's not fatigue. That's contamination, some kind of impurity introduced into the metal itself during the original smelting process, long before the folding and shaping even began." Kalus, standing nearby, studied the readout carefully. "A different failure, but from the same underlying problem. No way to verify the internal quality of the material before it becomes a finished weapon." "Exactly," I said. "Which means fixing this specific blade might solve today's problem, but it won't solve the bigger issue. If your forging tradition has no reliable way to catch contamination in the raw material either, this kind of failure could be waiting inside blades we haven't even thought to examine yet." Talus Vess absorbed this intense silence, his jaw tight. "You are telling me the danger is larger than a single flawed process. That it extends all the way back to how the raw metal itself is prepared." "I'm telling you that's a real possibility," I said carefully. "I can't confirm it without a lot more testing across a lot more samples. But if it's true, it means the inspection process the Council approved needs to go further than just scanning finished blades. It needs to reach back into how the raw material is sourced and refined in the first place." Talus was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly, some of the anger in his expression giving way to something more like grim determination. "Then we begin there. Fix my son's blade first, if you can. Save that discussion for after." I spent the next 2 days working alongside Laura and, eventually, a Threll metallurgist, stationed at the outpost, named Oren Kess, who arrived skeptical, but grew steadily more engaged as he watched the diagnostic process unfold. Unlike some of the officers back on the Council, Oren seemed genuinely fascinated, rather than threatened by what the scans revealed, asking sharp, detailed questions and, by the second day, contributing insights about the smelting process that helped narrow down exactly where the contamination had likely been introduced. "There is a specific stage," he explained, pulling up records from the outpost's own archive, where raw ore is combined with a stabilizing compound before the primary heating begins. If that compound is not measured with total precision, trace impurities can bond into the metal at a molecular level, invisible during every subsequent stage of forging, yet capable of weakening the final structure exactly the way we are seeing here. "Is that stage typically automated or done by hand?" I asked. "By hand," Oren said, something uneasy entering his voice as he realized the implication of his own answer. "As with the folding process itself, it has always relied on the smith's precision and experience, with no independent verification afterward." "Same blind spot," Laura said quietly, "just earlier in the process." Oren nodded slowly, clearly troubled by where this was leading. This could mean the flaw is even more widespread than the Council currently believes. Not limited to one forge line's folding technique, but present, potentially, in any blade whose raw material passed through a smith working during a period when this specific stabilizing measurement was slightly imprecise. We repaired Corin Vess's blade using the same diffusion bonding technique that had worked for Kalus, carefully reinforcing the fracture and 2 additional weak points the scans revealed nearby. By the time we finished, 3 days after arriving at the outpost, Corin had recovered enough to sit up in the medical bay and examine the repaired weapon himself, turning it over slowly in his hands, studying the pale seam now marking its length. "It looks different," he said quietly. "It is different," I said, "stronger at the repaired points than it was originally, but different, and visibly so." He was quiet for a moment, then looked up at his father, who stood nearby, watching with an expression that had softened considerably over the past 3 days. "Kalus Vorn carries his openly. I heard the story before we ever reached this outpost." "He does," I confirmed. Corin looked down at his own blade again, tracing the seam with careful fingers. Then I will carry mine the same way. Talus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and something passed between them that needed no further words. Before we left the outpost, Orin Kess approached me privately, his expression thoughtful, almost hesitant. I would like to study your diffusion bonding methods further, he said. Not simply to repair broken blades, but to develop a proper verification process for the smelting stage itself. If we can find a reliable way to detect contamination before the metal ever reaches the folding process, we could prevent this flaw from being introduced at all, rather than only catching it after a blade has already failed. I'd be glad to help however I can, I said. For what it's worth, that's a better long-term solution than anything I've done so far. I've just been fixing blades one at a time. What you're describing could prevent the problem entirely. Orin nodded, something like genuine excitement breaking through his usually measured demeanor. Then perhaps this is where the real work begins. Not simply repairing what is already broken, but building a tradition that catches its own flaws honestly, before they cost someone their life. We returned to our ship several days later, carrying detailed records of everything we had found at the outpost, along with Orin's growing collection of theories about improving the smelting verification process. Kalis remained quiet for most of the return journey, thoughtful in a way that suggested he was turning something over carefully in his mind. "You are troubled," I said eventually, finding him alone near the observation deck. "I am thinking about how close Corin came to losing far more than a blade," he said, "and how many others across the fleet might be carrying the same hidden risk right now, unaware, exactly as I once was." "The inspections are already spreading," I said. "It's slow, it's uncomfortable for a lot of people, but it's happening." "Slow may not be fast enough," Kalis said quietly. "Not for everyone." I did not have a perfect answer for that, because he was right, and we both knew it. Somewhere across the wider fleet, other blades were likely still waiting, hidden flaws sitting quietly inside metal that looked, on the surface, exactly as strong and trustworthy as it always had. But for the first time since a single blade had shattered on the floor of a repair bay weeks earlier, I understood that this was no longer just my problem to solve, or even Kalis's. It had become something larger, a shared effort now reaching across an entire fleet, drawing in officers, smiths, and engineers from two very different species, all slowly learning to look honestly at their own traditions, find the hidden weaknesses within them, and repair what they found, scars and all, rather than hiding behind the comfortable illusion that nothing important had ever been broken in the first place. That, I realized, watching the stars drift slowly past the observation deck beside a warrior who had once believed his entire worth was tied to a single unbroken blade, was probably the most valuable thing either of our peoples had gained from everything that started with one small, sharp sound echoing across the floor of a repair bay. Not a perfect fleet, not a perfect tradition, just an honest one, finally willing to look closely enough to see its own flaws, and brave enough to fix them.